I'd like to welcome everybody here tonight, not just from Exeter University, but from Cornwall and from Plymouth and from elsewhere. So that's the background to the global uncertainties. Part of it is attracting high-profile names to talk about some of the big challenges and give their experience, and it's a pleasure to have Shea from NATO. Jamie has been with NATO since 1980, and he's played a variety of roles within NATO. He's at the present time the Deputy Assistant Secretary General for emerging security challenges, which is a bit of a mouthful.
Yeah. Two business cards.
Exactly. Jamie is also, over his experience, engaged with various universities and also think tanks. And in that context, it's a real pleasure that Jamie is increasing his connections with Exeter, and particularly with the involvement of the Strategy and Security Institute. And Jamie is also, I'm not sure what the verb will be becoming an honorary professor of the university. So we're hoping that the collaboration with Jamie develops over the next few years in the context of the GU theme. And it's a great pleasure to have Jamie here at Exeter.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you. When I heard that there was a concert about to go on, it made me remember Frederick the Great, who famously said that diplomacy without arms is like music without instruments, but there's no music or no instruments from me this evening. But really, I'm so flattered and honoured to see such a large presence here this evening. A couple of days ago in Brussels, I was at an event where there were more people on the panel than in the audience. And that happens to me quite a lot these days. So I don't know what the secret of Exeter is and what you've done to bribe all of these people, Steve and Doug, but many thanks to all of you for coming this evening. What I'd like to do in the next sort of 30 minutes or so is to give you sort of a sense of how I, and to some degree we, over in Brussels at NATO headquarters, look at the sort of new security situation that we are in, and what we are going to try to do about it, and what some of the particular difficulties and challenges are that are inevitably sort of coming to the fore as we grapple with these issues. It's quite an irony, just a few days ago, when Gorbachev was in Berlin to mark the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, that he gave a speech warning of a new Cold War that could be coming along. And indeed, one of the most remarkable things is the way in which the security environment, which for a while in the 1990s seemed to be going so favourably, at least in Europe, allowing most NATO countries to focus their attention on places very far away from Europe, such as Afghanistan, and a time when NATO was much more visible for what it was doing outside Europe than inside Europe. It's quite remarkable to see that this deterioration is now largely in the European neighbourhood, whether it is from the Maghreb, across North Africa, into the Middle East, and up now through the Caucasus and Turkey, up to Ukraine. There is hardly now a country which is not either failed or failing, or any particular region which is stable. We are looking at islands of stability, whereas 10 years ago we were focusing, like in the Balkans, on islands of instability. The other day, Francesca Mogherini, who is, as you all know, the new High Representative in Brussels for the EU foreign policy, was saying that the paradox is that Europe is now the continent in the world which is the most magnetically attracting security instabilities and security problems, even compared with other regions. And so the question is how long will we be able, if this environment persists just across the Mediterranean or just across into the Middle East, how long Europe will be able to preserve itself as an island of stability if it's not able to export security outwards. One lesson from history, which my colleagues in the European Union are acutely aware of, is that you cannot be a global power and aspire to have global influence or send peacekeeping or common defence and foreign policy missions across the globe if you don't control your own neighbourhood. If you don't have instability, or stability rather, on your borders. What's going on? Well, first of all, the problem problem today, unlike the Cold War, is that there's no single sort of political issue which, if you can solve it, is going to produce sort of beneficial effects elsewhere. You know, during the Cold War, we knew that most problems, most conflicts in the world, not all, but many, were subsets of the Cold War. Secondary theatres, and if the central struggle between Western liberalism and Soviet communism could somehow be resolved, many other regional conflicts would quieten down as well, or at least become more amenable to solutions. Today, that's not the case any longer. You could solve an issue like Russia and Ukraine, which would have no bearing whatever on Islamic State. A couple of years ago, General Petraeus gave a famous speech in which he said that, you know, the basic problem in the Middle East was the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and if you could solve that, then most of the other issues in the region would be resolved. Now, nobody would say that. If we could solve the conflict between the Arabs and the Israelis tomorrow, and I wish we could, that would not stop the current tensions and conflicts going on within the Sunni community, nor between Sunnis and Shiites, or between Shiites and Sunnis and Christians and all of the others. So unfortunately, the conflicts now are more fragmented in terms of their solution. But the problem is they're not more fragmented in terms of their genesis and their ability to influence each other. The collapse of Libya means that it's now becoming the world's largest arms smuggling and trafficking area. I was in a meeting with Israelis the other day where they were deeply worried that problems in the Sinai on their border are being caused by weapons leaking out of Libya, fueling movements in that particular region. We were dealing yesterday with failed states. Now we're dealing with failed regions where problems in one area, such as Syria, quickly go over borders and contaminate issues in other areas. There's an immediate sort of cross-back phenomenon going on, which means that the problems are spreading much more rapidly than we can find ways to contain those particular issues as well. Let me just give you some statistics. I mean, 13.6 million people have been made into refugees by the conflict in Syria and Iraq. That's one of the largest in history. 10% of all Libyans are in militias. The number of people in Afghanistan who are involved in the narcotics industry is double the size of the Afghan National Army. 3,000 young people from EU countries have so far gone off to Syria to fight with the Islamic State. The Islamic State is able to attract 30,000 fighters from 80 different countries in the world, which means that although it may be operating locally and largely focusing on the caliphate, on the border between Syria and Iraq, it's able to recruit almost universally from across the globe, 30,000 fighters in all. And for the first time, we have a terrorist organization which has access to tanks, has access to jet fighters, controls large revenue streams amounting to about $1 billion overall, and $2 million every day from the illicit sale of oil, and therefore the control of artworks, the control of water, the control of power resources, and $46 million coming in last year also from hostage taking. So what we're also seeing now is that states like Russia are beginning to sort of pose as sub-state actors, little green men without insignia, tanks with their license plates taken off, going into Ukraine, creating a permanent confusion as to whether this is an act of international aggression or a spontaneous uprising of mistreated people, a civil war type situation within a country. Russia is denying any kind of involvement. It's using cyber, it's using energy security, it's using business networks, it's using media, but it's posing as a sub-state actor, not as a state. Whereas the problem for much of the Middle East is that groups like ISIS and many others are larger than the armed forces of the states that they are confronting in terms of effective fighting forces. They are creating now a situation of almost enduring partition. So that we are going to have a future made up of what is left of the legitimate states of the post-First World War period on a decreasing amount of territory, side by side with a number of frozen conflicts or black holes, together with new types of authorities, unrecognized, which are emerging. So we are seeing, if you like, sub-state actors like cyber hacktivists or Hezbollah, which possesses 50,000 missiles, or Colombian drug barons with their own air forces and their own submarines, acquiring the technologies, the money, and the destructive power that used to be the preserve of states, and states disguising themselves, as I say, as sub-state proxies as well. So we are having, if you like, the great mess, where all problems and all actors are merging with each other. Let me just give you another quick example of what I mean. I spent 4 years of my life dealing with the problem of improvised explosive devices in Afghanistan and trying to figure out what were the networks that were ultimately gathering the money, gathering the technology, controlling the laboratories, controlling the transport routes that smuggled ammonium nitrate and potassium chlorate into Afghanistan to produce these roadside bombs, which were amazingly easy and cheap to produce. 57 varieties like Heinz, costing between about $5 and $150 to make. And we found 8 essential networks, and 90% of those networks were organized crime. Classic organized crime networks, not linked ideologically to any jihadist movement. It was only the final 10% at the end of those networks which were really sort of in the hands and controlled by the Taliban. So the bad guys have this amazing propensity to share technology, to share money, to share personnel, to share weapons, to share know-how, whether in cyberspace or in the real world, and come together. Our ability in governments to build these networks, to counter these networks, inevitably is much slower. We're also at an end of a period where some of the essential assumptions that we started out at the end of the Cold War and we believed were self-evident truths are now being shown to be wrong. For example, that nationalism and identity would disappear with globalization integration. What we are would become more important than who we are. No. We're seeing in Europe, in Russia, Ukraine, in the Middle East, a reversion back into tribalist, blood, identity, sectarian politics. Who we are has now become the new reference point of who we want to be in the future, and we define ourselves by the people that we want to keep out of our particular communities. Second thing was that the internet would be a truth-telling machine. That the more the internet spread, the more it would become a kind of Wikipedia in which people would contribute elements of truth, building up a picture. So we would no longer need BBC World Service or Radio Free Europe. We wouldn't have to do state-level information any longer. Simply connectivity in itself would spread a message of liberalism, democracy, of tolerance, of knowledge and understanding. We're seeing increasingly that, of course, that is not true. The internet is a neutral element that could be used for any kind of message, and the bad messages can be relayed as effectively, if not more so, than the good message. The next illusion was that capitalism would automatically spread democracy, as it seemed to do in Asia in the 1970s. We now know that capitalism is an incredibly promiscuous system that you can latch on to any kind of authoritarian system, and authoritarian state capitalism can work as effectively, if not more so, as the classical liberal model. Certainly the Chinese and Mr. Putin believe that as well. Another illusion was that dialogue and technical cooperation, setting up sort of forums like the NATO-Russia Council, for example, involving Russia in exercises, putting ships together in piracy, would build a kind of bottom-up sense of cooperation, which over time would eliminate age-old geopolitical rivalries and geopolitical differences. We are now learning that it's almost impossible to eliminate history. Mr. Putin today talks of Novorossiya as if a border which Russia had in the past is as legitimate today as existing borders. This reminds me of a true story where I had tea several years ago with an old lady in Ljubljana, Slovenia, where she convinced me, and it took some convincing, but she did finally, that she'd lived in the same house all her life and lived in 7 different countries. And this is, of course, Europe, the history of Europe. And as we live in a Europe where every nation state has changed its borders several times, the idea that a previous border has the same legitimacy as an existing border, that a country which is a great power has the right to a natural sphere of influence, that people speaking the same language automatically become citizens of the mother country and should have double nationality or passports distributed to them. Again, this type of thinking we thought had really disappeared more or less with the end of the Second World War, and it's making a comeback. So we recognize that beneath the veneer of civilized integration, these old historical animosities are still rife. And if Russia opens it in Eastern Europe for Russia, what is to stop Hungary or any other states whose geographical borders or whose populations bear little resemblance to what they were before the First World War, for reopening these Pandora's box as well. So we have to look at the environment, and we have to realize that some of the assumptions that we were operating on as self-evident truths are no longer operative at all. Of course, an international security deterioration is like having a baby, ladies and gentlemen. It comes at an extremely inconvenient time, or almost by definition. And of course, it's the old Irish joke when you ask somebody coming out of a pub in Ballymurphy to give you directions, and he says, "I would not start from here. I would not start from here." And Europe and NATO countries are badly positioned in dealing with this sudden deterioration. Why? Well, the first thing, of course, is the legacy of 20 years of operations in Afghanistan and Iraq have created a certain degree of public skepticism regarding the utility of force and the value of armed forces. But more importantly, during the 20 years that we were in Iraq, not NATO as such, but NATO countries, definitely NATO in Afghanistan, and doing these essential stabilization operations, we have done something that we haven't really done. We've been at war and we've cut defense budgets. Normally, when you are in a military conflict, or even in a Cold War, you increase defense budgets and manpower. We've actually fought quite significant wars over the last 20 years, certainly some of the action in Afghanistan, while slashing our defense budgets. NATO average 10 years ago was 2%. Today it's about 1.3% of GDP on average. The UK went into Afghanistan able to deploy a division or two significant brigades simultaneously and persistently. Today that is barely a brigade in only one single theatre. The UK Army today at 82,000 is the smallest since the Napoleonic Wars, and the Royal Navy with 19 ships is the smallest since 1683. So in other words, we have sort of had the peace dividend three times. First, after the Cold War. Secondly, in the period of the operations, while we were deploying forces, while dramatically reducing the overall size of our armies, cannibalizing them, if you like, in order to have a certain sort of elite force of highly reactive forces able to deploy, but cannibalizing the depth and the mass. And then, of course, the third peace dividend was after Lehman Brothers in 2008 with the Euro crisis and recession predominantly in the Euro zone. And so now we face a situation, for example, where 66% of the French army, excuse me, let me backtrack, 66% of all of the cuts in the French civil service has been in the French army. In other words, the army has had to make a disproportionate contribution to the cuts that everybody has had to assume. We're in a situation where 50% of French helicopters can't fly because of lack of spare parts. Same situation in Germany, where transport planes break down, even when they have to fly the defense minister on an important diplomatic mission, where half of our equipment, through lack of maintenance or spare parts, isn't operative any longer. End of the Cold War, NATO had 30,000 tanks. Today, less than 6,000 overall. Now, I'm not arguing that at the end of the Cold War, cutting tanks did not make sense. Obviously it did. We thought that we were in a different paradigm where occupying territory with infantry was more important than defeating enemies, what's called force on force. We didn't feel that we would ever need to do collective defence ever again. And yet suddenly now that collective defence has become once again a priority, we lack the heavy lift capability, we lack the armour, we lack the very high readiness of forces, the pre-positioned equipment, the bases, the interoperability even, that we need to be able to do this kind of mission. In other words, we have military forces, but they're not necessarily suited for the kind of mission that we now have, where we have to make them, of course, significantly heavier and denser. There's also the legacy of the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. The United States stopped paying for World War II in which year? Anybody want to guess? 1965, 20 years after the war. And I think in the Vietnam War it finished just a couple of years ago. Joe Stiglitz, I'm sure you're familiar with that name, particularly in the economic fraternity, has done an interesting study for Columbia University calculating that the cost of the veterans alone for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan for the United States will run to the order of about $1.8, $1.9 trillion over the next few years. So it's very difficult to resource your military for potential new scenarios when you still have the legacy of damaged equipment, of veterans. I mean, that's in a way a good sign, because compared with the American Civil War, when about 50% of casualties ended up as fatal because of lack of medical attention, today it's almost less than 2-3%. Medical care is great, wonderful, but it does mean that the cost of veterans, compared with earlier wars, is now massively higher. The other reason why Europe is badly positioned is because, frankly, we had 20 years at the end of the Cold War to basically get more bang for our euro by integrating our military forces in Europe. And that's to say, achieving specialization, economies of scale, what today we call smart defense and pooling and sharing. We had 20 years to do that so that we could have much more effective forces, even with declining defence budgets. And let's be frank, we Europeans, we still manage to spend 180 billion euros a year, which is not comparable to the $500 billion of the United States, but it's not nothing, right? It's still double the size of the Chinese defence budget, for instance. But if you look around Europe, where you have 4 different types of fighter jet, 3 different types of tank, 17 different types of armoured personnel carriers, 16 military shipyards compared to only 6 in the United States, and where today in Europe 95% of all European armed forces are still under national command and control, and only 5% of European defence budgets are spent on multinational research and development, you can understand that we have still been largely in national stovepipes, where defence has been as much a national jobs protection scheme as an issue of having your armed forces ready. And now, suddenly, at a time when European integration, particularly in this country, is not the flavour of the month, let alone a European army, the financial necessity to have to do this and to start trusting each other and specialising and depending on each other is something that politically is not going to be so easy. So that, of course, hits us at a bad time. But let's look at the United States. Can we depend upon the US to do deterrence for us in the way that it has traditionally done? If you look at the United States, it does deterrence. Nobody else, at least in the NATO European world, does deterrence. It's done by the US. Remember, 326,000 troops in Europe, 7,000 nuclear weapons during the Cold War. Today, the United States has only 26,000 combat-ready forces in Europe. Not 326,000. Only 300 of those are east of the Elbe River on the territory of the new member states. The US, at the end of the Cold War, had 10,000 tanks in Europe. Today, 20. And they're basically for a training exercises in Germany. The US commitment to Europe today is to send a one brigade combat team back to Europe in a crisis. Now, do not misunderstand me. I'm not saying for 1 minute that the United States is not committed to the defence of Europe. It is. And indeed, when we had the issue in Ukraine recently, the US was the first country to actually deploy special forces quickly in Poland and the Baltic states for what we call in NATO reassurance, to wave the flag and to show that the Baltic states were not alone, and to show Russia, had it had any kind of intention to destabilize a NATO member state, that a fight against one is a fight against all. That deterrence is about participation as much as it is about equipment. So the United States has been in the front line, but the United States is clear that it wants to see what the Europeans are going to do in this particular climate. The US, of course, is spread very thinly across the globe. You see, the United States is unique. China can deploy its forces regionally. Mr. Putin can focus his forces regionally. He does not have any more than the Chinese multinational alliances to sustain or geographical defense obligations. The United States has bases and forces in 97 countries in the world today. It's got now 3,500 in West Africa dealing with Ebola, about 3,000 now in Iraq dealing with the ISIS campaign. There is, of course, the pivot to Asia. So the United States, which is also going to lose, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, $100 billion out of the defense budget in the next 5 years because of sequestration, clearly, has to have priorities and also, of course, needs more burden sharing. And that, of course, is one of the reasons why Robert Gates, the outgoing American Secretary of Defense, warned famously in Brussels a few years ago that he was the last Cold War U.S. Defense Secretary working for a president who calls himself the first Pacific U.S. president, and that in these particular circumstances, obviously, the United States could no longer, as it does today, pay 75% of NATO's overall defense budgets. One country, 75%. So where does that leave us? 10 minutes. 10 minutes. That leaves us with the following critical challenges. Number one, obviously we have to shore up collective defense again. NATO has to be loved, if we can, but a defense organization has to be respected and feared by its adversaries, I would argue, more than being loved. And this is not easy because when the new members of NATO joined back in the 90s, they joined without any military presence. At the time, because Russia was a benign country, we did not consider it was either desirable or necessary to deploy forces on their territory. As Radek Sikorski, the former Polish foreign minister, liked to say, we've been in NATO for 15 years, and what have we got to show for it? A virtual training center in Bydgoszcz. But now we, of course, have to have a presence. But the problem is that if we go back to having a big presence in Central and Eastern Europe, it's going to be expensive. It may be provocative vis-à-vis Russia. We want to stop a Cold War, not facilitate a Cold War. Of course, in security policy, there's always this problem. How do you react to something without making it worse than it was already? So that your solution becomes, in fact, part of the problem. Always a difficult dilemma. So we don't want to provoke the Russians, but also people say, yeah, but, if Mr. Putin sort of goes back to being friendly tomorrow, we don't want to have a load of concrete and fixed bases in Eastern Europe, which is going to be a kind of, sunken investment. So let's go for a reinforcement strategy where we keep the troops in Western Europe, but we quickly reintroduce them into Eastern Europe when we need them. Advantages, less provocative to the Russians. Second advantage is that if the problem is in the south rather than the east, these troops can go south. So in other words, we get multifunctionality out of them. We have a readiness action plan for the south as well as the east. It's what the Americans call a TUFA. You familiar with a TUFA? TUFA? Two for the price of one. A TUFA. And so do that. But of course, the problem there with this strategy is, will our forces be quick enough to go back to Poland or the Baltic states in just 48 hours? And if we have the high readiness, do we have the responsiveness? Let me explain what I mean. It's okay for having very high readiness forces, but if your political decision-making takes days and days to say, is it a duck? Does it, I'm talking about the little green men. Is it really an attack? Is it local? Is it deliberate aggression? The Russians are expert at the hybrid warfare, which is aimed to sow confusion and discord, to make our analysis difficult, to make our decision-making slow. And so what's the point of having very high readiness at the military level if your political level is not able to take timely decisions? And therefore, early warning, good intelligence, clearing up the confusion is going to be crystal clear. So the first task that we have in NATO is to develop this very high readiness strategy. Second task is the 2%. We all agreed in Wales, just up the road from here at our summit in Newport a couple of weeks back, that we would go back towards 2% of our defence budgets. But this is not going to be easy. Belgium, for example, announced last week that it was going in the other direction, cutting $1.85 billion from its defence budget. So how can we incentivise our member states to gradually go back up? I mean, just saying 2% or nothing isn't going to work. We need to direct them towards using the money more efficiently, towards what kind of contribution they can make. We need to hit their budget cycles, because for the time being, many defence budgets are locked up until 2016, so governments can't really change them. But this is going to be a very, very important signal to the United States in particular, that the Europeans are willing to make an effort. We need to look much more, as I said earlier, at defence integration. Some countries do it already. Benelux have more or less integrated their navies and their air forces. The Czechs and the Slovaks are integrating their air defence. The Brits are forming an expeditionary unit with the Scandinavian countries. The French and the British are participating in common nuclear patrolling and nuclear research and development and so on. All around Europe, you see these clusters of countries forming. We call this framework nations, where a large country provides the framework into which the small countries with niche capabilities plug and play, as we say. But we need to push this forward. By the way, this type of approach is much more palatable to we Brits, because it is not top down from Brussels. It's more spontaneous, bottom up, with groups of countries pairing together, particularly those countries like the UK, Denmark and Estonia that have been together in Afghanistan and have built levels of trust. The next thing we need to do is to the extent defence capacity building. We've done a lot of wars for other people, and they haven't always been very grateful to us, frankly, that we fought their wars on their behalf. And too often it ended up, as Tom Friedman of the New York Times has put it, of us against them, whereas it should be their fight, them against them. As Tom said, we've tended to want the thing more than they want it. And if you want peace in Afghanistan more than the Afghans want it, you're on a losing wicket. So one of the new things that we're going to have to do, and quickly, is how can we buttress those government structures, those military structures in North Africa, in the Middle East, in Iraq, so that their military forces, the Iraqi army is the big issue at the moment, of course, are more resilient, better led, more capable, don't collapse. 3 Iraqi divisions collapsed within 48 hours against 15,000 ISIS fighters. That was not particularly impressive, right? So clearly this is easier said than done when it comes to training forces, but how can we help them to stand on their own 2 feet and make it their fight rather than our fight? And that's going to be, I think, one of the big issues in security from now on. Final word, as I come to the end, the other thing we have to do is to enhance partnerships. And I want to illustrate this very briefly, coming back to what I mentioned earlier with the improvised explosive devices. We spent $65 billion in NATO trying to deal with these improvised devices. Satellite observation of ground, route clearance vehicles, hardening armour, jammers, etc., medical evacuation so that people would survive by being well treated. Every kind of thing under the sun, but the number of incidents, the number of devices multiplied. As quick as we could pull them out the ground, they were going back in. And then suddenly we thought, well, wait a minute, if we're going to get intelligent about this, we need to start looking at partnerships and forming a network. So what did we do? Well, first of all, we got onto Interpol saying, well, look, can we share biometric data, fingerprints, DNA, gathered from these devices with you? Because we don't have a database, but the FBI, the police, you have one. Oh no, sorry, we can't do that because your military information is classified. We've got to observe privacy and proprietary legal things, so we can't share. So in other words, if somebody arrives at Newark Airport, we can't use your biometric information on our database in immigration to identify that person. We solved that problem Took a lot of time, a lot of lawyers, but we solved it. And now we can declassify and we can put it up. I mentioned ammonium nitrate. Where was this coming from? Who were the manufacturers? Did they know who they were selling it to? Could they change the mix of the chemicals so that these things would be much harder to exploit for bomb purposes? Could we put forensics, signatures, into the chemicals so that we could more easily identify them? We could do them with nuclear materials. Why not with chemicals? So we worked on that. We worked with the customs. We worked with the intelligence community to identify these networks. We then had these special forces in Afghanistan who said, well, we can't collect DNA because we've got no laboratories to collect the information. We built mobile laboratories. Then they couldn't reach back. They didn't have a reach back facility, so they couldn't send digitally the DNA material over the internet to a laboratory in Rochester in Kent, which was able then to do the analysis and the preservation. We solved that problem. Next thing, the Afghans said we don't recognize the crime of planting an IED. We recognize the crime of blasphemy, but not planting an IED. And so, we're not going to do anything with the perpetrators. And then the judges couldn't handle DNA evidence. You get the idea. So one by one, we worked on all of these issues to get the other people to cooperate with us. And then for a fraction of the money that we were spending on dealing with the bang, because we moved to the left of the bang and we moved to the right of the bang and built an intelligent network, we solved it. Piracy is similar, where an EU embargo on outboard motors to Somali pirates can be just as effective as a lot of ships are sailing up and down, consuming vast sums of money in the hope of seeing a pirate and capturing that person. For every problem, there's an expensive solution. The military solution is not always the best or the brightest or the most cost-effective. And so what we need to do is not simply define the military role and then analyze the solution of the problem around it, but first of all analyze the problem and the solution and then see to what degree the military are part of that or not. So partnership's key. So I conclude. I just want to leave 5 conclusions in your heads. Number 1, question your assumptions. And this is where you in the academic community can help us with your knowledge and your ability to reflect. Too often an assumption becomes a kind of, inviolable truth, like the emperor has no clothes. Nobody dares to question it. And we always think, well, it may not work today, but it'll work tomorrow. Let's just continue with the strategy because it will work eventually. No. You remember Einstein? The beginning of madness is what? Thinking that if you can ask the same question over and over again and expect a different answer, we've got to be much better at questioning our assumptions. Number 2, assessment. We tend to think that because there's something going up and running called a process, meetings are taking place, fact-finding teams are going out, that things are happening. That is a classical problem of diplomats, process. There's lots of activity, so the strategy is working. No. We've got to be much better at assessing our strategy. What are the metrics? How do we know if we're failing or succeeding here? Is this a tactical defeat and a strategic victory, or a strategic tactical victory and strategic defeat? You get the idea. We're not good at this. And again, the academic community can help us a lot with, assessment, going in and saying, look, guys, I'm very sorry, but your strategy is not working, and I've got every reason to believe it's not going to work any better tomorrow either. And now's the time before it's too late and you waste even more money to start changing it. That's the next thing. Next thing, as we argue about response, how do we have responses which de-escalate rather than escalate the situation? Because security is always about, remember the Anglo-German naval race before the First World War, action, reaction. You remember Thucydides, the rise of Sparta and the fear that it caused in Athens. And how do we therefore respond in a way that provides security, but as John Kerry would say, leaves the off-ramp to get out of the crisis? Smart interventions. Is there such a thing as smart interventions? Afghanistan, we intervened big time. Did it succeed? Syria, we didn't intervene at all. Did it succeed? President Obama says, don't do the stupid stuff, right? I think the S stood for something else, but the official version is don't do the stupid stuff. In other words, you're right. Let's not do the stupid stuff. But not doing the stupid stuff should not lead to a Hamlet kind of self-paralysis. all options are bad options, all options carry two risks. I mean, security policy at the end of the day is about doing things, not avoiding things, but getting it right. So smart interventions. Is there a smart way of dealing with issues where we end up doing more good than harm? That is, again, something that you guys here in the academic community can help us with. And finally, how do we build these partnerships, these coalitions, effectively, these clusters of the right expertise, the best and the brightest, coming at it from different angles, helping us to get the right analysis, helping us to identify the local approach. The mixture of the locals, it's their fight, and what we can do to help them. So some of the things that I think that Exeter University is well positioned, the Strategy and Security Institute is well positioned as well, and I hope that some of you would find that this is interesting enough to devote your lives to, frankly, because you remember Steve Jobs, that institutions don't innovate, people do. I always like to quote that. It's absolutely true. Apple, when it invented the iPhone, was spending 1/100th of what IBM was spending on research and development, but ultimately they're the ones who dominated the market for years and years. So remember, institutions don't innovate, people do, and all of these problems can be solved, but only if people like you don't do what Russell Brand is doing and opting out, and not voting and not engaging, but absolutely all of you get involved in this. Winston Churchill, people quote Churchill, but I like a quotation that's often used. He once said to somebody, "You have many enemies." He said, "That's great, because it meant for once in your life you stood up for something." You have many enemies. That means for once in your life you had the courage to stand up for something. And given these challenges, I hope that all of you, when you graduate from this place, will stand up for these things as well. Thank you very much. Look. Hello. Sorry, Doug, I did my best, but still some time for questions, I hope.
My microphone is working now. Great. So we don't have much time, so I'll just go straight to the Q&A. So any hands, please?
Zacharias Litney from University of Plymouth. And my question is, there's latest reports talking about ISIS expanding, actually, and establishing a stronghold in the western city of Derna, Libya.
Yep.
And
right.
how does NATO think about that in terms of security threats in the Mediterranean region and Southern Europe in particular?
Well, that's a very good question. I'm going to give short answers, not because I'm evading the question, but because short answers hopefully will mean that we can have as many questions as possible. The answer, of course, is that we did in Libya an air campaign which was not followed up by any kind of implementation on the ground. And there was, I suppose, a belief, which is understandable, that the end of the Gaddafi regime would bring about maybe something better or more democratic in its place. I also have to be honest and say, quite candidly, the Libyans that we were dealing with at the time, who were, if you like, the recognized sort of successor government in waiting, did not want any international presence. We offered one, so did the EU, so did the UN, and they said no. And it's only recently, years later, with the security situation deteriorating, that they've come to us, which, by the way, is not an excuse for not following up an air operation with something on the ground. Colin Powell once said, it's like the Pottery Barn. If you break it, you own it. You break it, you own it, and you have to deal with it. Well, the problem at the moment, though, is that in Libya, the conditions are so chaotic that the EU and NATO and the UN simply can't find the basis for any kind of mission, which depends on a certain minimal degree of protection and stability to be able to function. Otherwise, you have, like the EU, a mission which is meant to be there, but actually is in a hotel in Italy, waiting to be able to go there as such. So you've got a good point there. Libya is a great example where you have to think through the long-term consequences of what you're doing. What's the answer in the long run? Well, certainly a lot of attention, much more attention to Libya, because of course, you tend to focus on Syria, Iraq, it gets all of the attention, and you take your eye off of what's going elsewhere. The one thing about ISIL, which I will say, is that of course it's in danger of overextending itself. The more population it has to control, the more mouths it has to feed, the more it provides governance, the more people are going to get upset when it can't get the electricity working any better than the old government could get the electricity working, the more it has to generate revenue in order to sustain all of its fighters and the population, the more it can be suffocated, the more it can be squeezed. I mean, the beauty of Al-Qaeda, if I can use that sort of oxymoronic term, the beauty of Al-Qaeda is it was so small, it was so tiny that it could, keep going on a sort of a shoestring. That's not the case with ISIL. So the attempt to build too many caliphates too quickly, rather like a business expanding too quickly, could in fact be the source of its own destruction.
Hi. You mentioned earlier that the presence of NATO forces in Central and Eastern Europe could be provocative to Russia. John Mearsheimer says that the very presence of NATO in Eastern Europe has already been provocative to Russia. He says that Ukraine crisis is the West's fault. Do you think he's right and we should work to being more cooperative with Russia, or do you think he's just fallen for Putin's smooth words?
I think it's utter nonsense. And I know Mearsheimer. I've met him on several occasions, but I think this is complete. This is nonsense. Let me be crystal clear. We enlarged NATO and had perfectly good relations with Russia for many, many years. We had the NATO-Russia Council, the NATO-Russia Founding Act, joint peacekeeping together in the Balkans, cooperation on Afghanistan, joint narcotics interdiction operations together in Afghanistan. For a long period, it was not a problem for Russia. I'm not saying that they greeted it with open arms any more than we greeted their policy in Chechnya with open arms, but it did not lead to any kind of breakdown of the relationship. Indeed, countries that joined NATO, like Poland, Baltic states, signed border agreements with Russia, vastly increased their trade and mutual investments and so on. So I would argue that it only became a problem when Mr. Putin wanted it to become a problem as a convenient kind of football to present himself as the aggrieved party and the victim. So yes, I agree with your formulation in that respect. The second observation is that Ukraine was not joining NATO. Ukraine constitutionally is bound to neutrality. If they want to join NATO, they have to change their constitution. And they're not seeking NATO membership. Poroshenko, Yatsenuk and so on have not even spoken about it. This is not on their radar screen at the moment. Russia went into Crimea as a response to an association agreement with the European Union, not anything that NATO was doing. We even explicitly in 2008 refused to give Georgia a membership action plan, which would have been the first stage on the rung of preparing for enlargement. So Russia was sort of responding to a scenario which had disappeared several years previously as something that was going to happen. The candidates that we've got in the front row are more in the Balkans, like Montenegro, than in that part of the world. Third observation, if you'll permit me, because I honestly feel that this is an issue. Gorbachev said explicitly in Berlin, that Russia at no time received any guarantee on NATO enlargement in the 1990s, only a guarantee on East Germany, not on Eastern Europe, and this was not even thought of at a time when these countries were still members of the Warsaw Pact, by the way. But my main point is the following. Where does Russia have troops today? A big army in eastern Ukraine, Crimea, in a neutral country. Where does Russia have troops today? In Moldova, large numbers in Transnistria, a country which is constitutionally pledged in neutrality. Where does Russia have 15,000 forces? In Armenia, another neutral country, which is not even suggested once. Russia's speaking about Kazakhstan, a country which... So what I'm trying to say is that, if Putin is saying not joining NATO, neutrality is a kind of implicit security guarantee, the way that his forces are acting is not really bearing that out. The other thing, by the way, and I can tell you this because I lived this very intensely, Ukraine only wanted to join NATO after Russia invaded it. Just like, it was only Russian bullying against Eastern Europe in the 90s that made these countries actually want to join NATO. So in other words, the more Russia complained about the thing, the more the countries got scared and thought, oh my God, the only refuge is in NATO enlargement. So NATO enlargement is something which has not been imposed on Russia. Russia actually has had quite an active role in creating NATO enlargement, and I think we need to remember that. History has got to be, forgive me, final comment. There was an American judge called Oliver Wendell Holmes, and he said something that I repeat to myself every day. He said, everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but everybody is not entitled to their own facts. And, you know, it's very important in all of these debates, you know, to remember what actually happened, rather than the kind of the uses and abuses of history, to quote Margaret Macmillan, that tend to sort of dominate so much of the debate today.
Questions? There's another one there, and there's one here.
Sorry, that was a long answer. I really apologise, but you probably saw that you got under my skin with that question, because it's true. It's been so much part of the narrative.
That's fine. My question is, what efforts is NATO and other NATO states making to starve some of these armed organizations of weapons? Because we know ISIS is being strong today because they've got weapons at their disposal. For instance, Boko Haram we have in Nigeria is waxing strong because they've got arms in their disposal. And some of these arms, I am aware, or I suspect, are manufactured by some NATO states. So what is NATO doing at the level of NATO to ensure armed violence are deterred by starving armed organizations of weapons? Thank you.
Another question there.
From what I've gathered, you aim at facilitating international security through basically strengthening NATO through expanding military budgets, for instance, or through specializing. My question is, to what extent do you think that traditional armies are really able to face those decentered multilateral conflicts that we see rising around the world today, that derive mainly from ethnic or religious frictions instead of really national aggression?
Oh, yeah, thank you. They're two brilliant questions, and difficult to give, 30-second sort of soundbite answers to those two. But anyway, very quickly, on the arms, a very good question. I mean, one of the problems, of course, we have today is that everybody manufactures arms, and therefore, even if we had an embargo by all of the NATO countries, this wouldn't stop all of the horizontal proliferation, as we call it, supply of fissile materials, of missile technologies, of drones. 65 countries in the world today manufacture drones. So, we've had globalization has led to this kind of democratization of production and access to technology. So you can get it from virtually anybody. And obviously a lot of international criminal networks. You can buy a lot of the technology on eBay, for example, on the internet as well, from private suppliers. So blocking this kind of thing is not easy. One sort of simple embargo by NATO would have value, symbolic value perhaps, but wouldn't do a lot, number one. Number two, we're dealing with countries which accumulated vast amounts of weapons, so that when they collapse, the fact that, they've had this massive concentration, Libya being a case in point, floods the market throughout the entire region, precisely because of the excessive militarization. I mean, I remember, for example, the problem we had in Kosovo in the 1990s, because Albania had stockpiled vast amounts of weapons, during the old Enver Hoxha period, and when that collapsed following a period of an investment scheme, they went flooding into Kosovo and throughout the region. So one of the things I think we really have to look at better is how countries are accumulating slowly vast amounts of weapons, and the safety of those weapons. I mean, we've spent a lot of effort on nuclear safety, several summits, but we have to look at this thing as well. Now, there are some things out there. There's an arms trade treaty, as you know, that was concluded by the United Nations last year and is coming to effect. Ideas of transparency, for example, in terms of exports, putting more registration of weapons so that DNA in weapons, so you can trace them more easily. And of course, things like blood diamonds, trying to curb things that are used to procure weapons, like illicit extraction by organizations in Africa of diamonds or precious metals. I mean, the Taliban was financing itself in Afghanistan not just through narcotics, but largely by exploiting precious minerals and things like that. So sometimes it's easier to control that kind of thing, the illicit trade in precious metals and resources, and then to curb the arms trade than the other way around. But it's a great question. question, and I don't pretend to have an easy answer. But there are lots of things going on. Also, destruction of Essex weapons, where one of the problems is countries keep a load of junk weapons that may not be useful to them, but can be used by sub-state actors. And there's a lot of initiatives called SALV, small arms and light weapons, to put those in better storage and safe destruction and the rest. Second question, really good question. Yes, I mean, it's a chicken and egg thing. You can't succeed with armed forces alone, but you can't succeed without armed forces. So often the armed forces are the structure around which you build everything else. Let me just give you one example. We had a meeting with the United Nations last week on the future of Afghanistan post-ISAF, because as you know, the ISAF mission in Afghanistan finishes at the end of the year. And we said to you, you guys are staying on, aren't you, with a large civilian mission now that the military is winding down? Because obviously, after the military operation, civilians say, no, so we're leaving as well. What? Yeah, once you military guys are out, we have to go too, because there's no structure to protect us any longer. So, it's not so much that, the civilian operation follows the military one, it's that the military operation provides the basic structure, engineering, communications, safety, mobility, transport, which allows the others to operate. Look at Hurricane Haiyan in the Philippines. Who's the first in? With the tents, the medical supplies, often the military. They're not necessarily the best responder for the long run. Look at Ebola at the moment, but they do provide a basic structure which allows a lot of the others to operate. They have their usefulnesses, not just for war fighting, but for a lot of different sort of sub-conflict type situations as well.
Do you see parallels between NATO's actions in Afghanistan and America's war in Vietnam, that Nixon's policy of Vietnamization ultimately ended in failure? Did we leave Afghanistan prematurely?
And the next question.
Hello, I'm John McPhee from the Strategy and Security Institute here at Exeter. Where do you see the next deployment of a NATO quick reaction force?
Oh, yes, thank you.
Geographically.
Okay, really good questions again, and I'm sorry if I'm not around for the others, but you do want me to stay married, don't you? Thank you. Yes, I mean, obviously Afghanistan is different. UN mandate, repeatedly renewed for 13 years every year. 46 countries participating in the operation, 24 countries that are not even NATO members. Even Mongolia is there, even Tonga is there with forces. It's been one of the largest coalitions ever. At the invitation of the Afghan government, which has provided the mandate as well. So, I would argue that in terms of legitimacy, in terms of participation, it's vastly different. On the other hand, sort of certain lessons, yes, about the ink spot strategy. You remember we had that debate in Afghanistan, like the Americans had it in Vietnam. You remember, secure the village, secure the hamlet, provide government. Remember, government in a box in Vietnam, and then it will grow to other places. So yes, I mean, from a historical perspective, you're absolutely right. There are similarities there. Failure, well, who's the biggest ally of America in Asia today, apart from Japan? Vietnam. It's amazing if you think of the animosity. I've been to Vietnam many times, and I remember going around the Museum of the War in Saigon and seeing an enormous amount of propaganda directed against the Americans. And it's amazing, 20 years later, how suddenly they're doing joint naval exercises together in the Pacific. So sometimes, the legacy can die quickly. Afghanistan, who knows? Who knows? I hear optimists and pessimists. That without us, although we're not going away, we're not leaving, we're just transitioning to a new mission, which is an essential training mission. I mean, if we stay forever, would the Afghans love us more? Do we attract the Taliban by being there and make it more difficult for the Afghans to reach their own kind of solutions? The Afghans have got a fantastic way of sort of muddling through. It may be messy, it may not be our solution, it's the Afghan way, but it works for them. So, I think the jury is still out on whether, some years down the road, this is going to be seen as a success or failure. In terms of creating Switzerland in Central Asia, yes, it will be a failure. But in terms of at least giving Afghanistan the basis to move forward, who knows? We'll have to see. So that was the first issue, and again, the second thing, I really apologise.
1 minute.
1 minute, yeah. What was the second question? I apologise. I was so busy. Oh, the next thing. Yeah, no, I think for the time being it's in the neighbourhood. As I said, I think the lesson for both the EU and NATO is that we cannot, project ourselves on the global stage if we don't have some kind of stability in our own neighbourhood. And I see, therefore, a mixture of readiness forces for, defence in Eastern Europe, but readiness forces for out of area. And let me, in the 10 seconds I've got left, just give you an illustration. I went to a meeting of the EU the other week, and they said, "Oh, Jamie, we all agree with what you're doing about these high readiness forces for your sort of Eastern European defence, but we're fishing in the same pool of very rare high readiness forces that we need for the EU battle groups to go to Mali and to go to the Central African Republic." And, and again, is that more important than Russia? It's difficult to argue. So we're going to have to make sure that we have a kind of system of using these forces in a way to leave some capacity over for a crisis that could break out somewhere else.
Sure, we could go on for much longer. Jamie did mention about enhancing partnership. I hope our partnership continues because, very much it's a two-way thing that Jamie mentioned about academics and their role, but I think it's also important that policymakers challenge us to make our research appropriate and relevant, and also the way in which we communicate.
Yeah,
that research is very much a two-way process, and I'm hoping and looking forward to Jamie being enhancing our partnership over the years in your role here at Exeter. I'd like to thank Doug Stokes, who led the Q&A session. Doug is the Professor of International Relations in the Politics Department here at Exeter, and I would like to thank you all for coming out and staying on tonight, and particularly for Jamie and his excellent talk.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.